The first gunshot had scattered the birds from the cottonwood trees when Prudence Zimmerman bolted from the stagecoach, her skirts tearing on sage as she ran blindly into the vastness of the Wyoming territory. It was 1875, and she had exactly $3 to her name, a wedding ring she'd stolen off a drunk passenger, and a desperate need to disappear. The second gunshot had brought her to her knees somewhere in the foothills, miles from the nearest settlement. Now, as night descended over the high plains, Prudence huddled beneath an outcropping of rock, shivering violently as rain began to fall. Her lungs, already weak from years of working in her father's textile mill back east, seized in the cold mountain air. The coughing started softly, then built to a racking crescendo that bent her double. Lucas Sutton heard the sound from half a mile away, where he'd made camp after a long day tracking a stray from his small herd. 10 years in these mountains had taught him to recognize every natural sound, and this, a human struggling for breath, was out of place. He doused his fire and mounted his horse, Winchester rifle balanced across the saddle. The woman was nearly unconscious when Lucas found her, her body convulsing with each desperate attempt to draw breath. Blood flecked her lips, stark against her pallid skin. Without hesitation, he dismounted and approached slowly, hands visible. "Madam," he called softly, "I mean no harm." Prudence startled, scrambling backward until her spine hit rock. Another coughing fit seized her, this one so violent she couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. When it finally subsided, she tried to form words, but only a broken rasp emerged. Lucas knelt beside her, draping his oilskin coat over her trembling shoulders. "You're safe," he said, his voice steady as he supported her weight. "Rest now." Prudence hadn't known safety since leaving Philadelphia, perhaps even before. But something in this stranger's weathered face, the steadiness of his gray eyes, perhaps made her believe him. As consciousness slipped away, she felt herself being lifted, carried through the rain toward the promise of warmth. Lucas's cabin stood in a sheltered draw beneath towering pines. It wasn't much, a single room with a stone hearth, a narrow bed, and furnishings he'd crafted himself over lonely winters. But it was dry, and the fire he quickly built drove away the chill. He worked efficiently, stoking the flames before turning his attention to the woman. She was young, perhaps 23, with dark hair that had come loose from its pins. Her clothes were fine but travel-worn, and the mud coating her boots suggested she'd been running for some distance. Most concerning was her breathing shallow and labored even in unconsciousness. Lucas mixed honey with whiskey and a pinch of the herbs he'd learned to use from an old Shoshone woman years before. When the woman stirred, he supported her head, helping her drink the mixture. "Small sips," he instructed. "It'll ease your breathing." Prudence's eyes fluttered open, panic immediately flooding her expression. She tried to sit up, but weakness and another bout of coughing forced her back down. Where she managed, her voice barely audible. "My cabin about 15 miles north of South Pass City," Lucas answered, sitting back to give her space. "Name's Lucas Sutton. Found you half drowned in the rain with a cough that sounds like it's tearing you apart. Want to tell me what you're doing alone in these mountains?" Prudence weighed her options, which were few. The man hadn't taken advantage of her vulnerability, and the warm cabin was infinitely preferable to dying of exposure. Still, caution was second nature now. "Prudence," she offered finally, omitting her surname. "I was traveling on the stagecoach to Fort Bridger when," she hesitated, unsure how much to reveal, "when circumstances required me to leave the coach early." Lucas's expression remained neutral, though his eyes narrowed slightly. "That's a 40-mile walk through mountain country. Not exactly a Sunday stroll for someone with lungs like yours." "I had little choice," she replied, another cough building in her chest. Lucas didn't press further. Instead, he moved to the stove, ladling stew into a wooden bowl. "You need to eat, then rest. Whatever trouble you're in can wait till morning." Prudence accepted the food gratefully, though her hands shook with exhaustion. The stew was simple venison, potatoes, and wild onions, but it was the first hot meal she'd had in days. As she ate, she studied her rescuer covertly. Lucas Sutton was not what she'd imagined when she thought of frontier men. Tall and lean, with sun-weathered skin and light brown hair that curled slightly at his collar, he moved with the quiet confidence of someone comfortable with solitude. His clothes were practical flannel shirt, worn denim pants, scuffed boots but clean. Most surprising were his hands. Though calloused from work, they possessed a certain gentleness as he tended the fire. "Why would you help a stranger?" she asked, setting aside her empty bowl. Lucas glanced up, something unreadable crossing his face. "Out here, refusing help is a death sentence. I've been on both sides of that equation." He made up a pallet near the fire, insisting she take the bed while he slept on the floor. Too exhausted to argue, Prudence sank into the comfort of a real mattress for the first time in weeks. Despite her wariness, sleep claimed her almost immediately. Dawn broke clear and cold over the mountains. Lucas was already gone when Prudence woke, though the fire had been built up and a pot of coffee sat warming on the stove. Her chest felt marginally better after a night's rest, though each deep breath still triggered spasms of pain. She explored the cabin cautiously. A bookshelf held a surprising collection volumes of Emerson and Thoreau, alongside practical guides to farming and animal husbandry. A desk beneath the window contained neat stacks of papers, and above it hung a detailed map of the territory with pencil markings noting water sources and grazing areas. The door opened, bringing a rush of crisp mountain air. Lucas entered, arms full of firewood, and nodded at her. "Fever's broken," he observed. "You've got some color back." "Thank you," Prudence said, suddenly conscious of her disheveled appearance. "For everything, I should be moving on as soon as possible." Lucas stacked the wood beside the hearth. Moving on where exactly? The question hung between them. Prudence had no destination, no plan beyond escaping the men who pursued her. "I thought so," Lucas said when she remained silent. "Whatever you're running from, you won't get far in your condition. Stage doesn't come through for another week, and the next settlement's a 3-day ride." "I can't stay here," Prudence insisted, anxiety rising. "It isn't safe for you." Lucas poured coffee for them both. "Why don't you tell me what kind of trouble has a well-spoken woman jumping from stage coaches and running through rainstorms?" Prudence wrapped her hands around the warm mug, drawing strength from its solidity. The whole story was too complex, too dangerous to share. But perhaps a version of the truth would suffice. "I worked as a governess in Philadelphia," she began, the lie coming easily after weeks of practice. "My employer made inappropriate advances. When I refused him, he accused me of stealing. No one would believe my word against his, so I fled." It was close enough to reality, though it omitted crucial details like the documents she'd discovered in her employer's desk. Papers implicating several prominent Philadelphians in a scheme that had defrauded the government of millions. Papers she'd taken, intending to deliver them to a federal marshal before realizing the conspiracy reached further than she'd imagined. Lucas studied her face, his expression suggesting he recognized the gaps in her story. "Rich men have long arms," he said finally. "But they tend to lose interest in small matters eventually." "This isn't small," Prudence murmured before she could stop herself. "Figured as much." Lucas stood, reaching for his hat. "Well, you're welcome to stay until you're stronger or until you figure out where you're headed." "I've got cattle to tend, but I'll be back by sundown." After he left, Prudence spent the day alternating between rest and exploration of the immediate surroundings. The cabin stood in a natural clearing, with a small creek running nearby and mountains rising dramatically to the west. A modest corral held 3 horses, and beyond that stretched a meadow where a small herd of cattle grazed. The isolation was both terrifying and comforting. No one would find her here, but if they did, help would be too distant to matter. When Lucas returned, he brought fresh trout for their supper. As they ate, he told her about his decade in Wyoming, coming west after the war with nothing but determination, working cattle drives and in mining camps before saving enough to claim this land. He spoke matter-of-factly, without self-pity for the hardships he'd clearly endured. "And your family?" Prudence asked. "Are they back east?" Lucas's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Lost my parents before the war, no siblings. There's not much back there for me now." Prudence understood isolation all too well. Her own parents had died of influenza when she was 18, leaving her alone in a city where survival required constant vigilance. "It must be lonely," she observed, looking around the single-room cabin. Lucas smiled slightly. "There's a difference between being alone and being lonely." "Took me a while to learn that." The next morning, Prudence's cough returned with renewed force. Lucas listened to her breathing with concern before retrieving a small wooden box from beneath his bed. Inside were dried herbs and tinctures, remnants of knowledge shared by the Shoshone healer who had once saved his life. "This will help open your lungs," he explained, mixing a pungent mixture into hot water. "But you need to rest. This kind of cough can turn deadly if you push yourself." For 3 days, Prudence remained at the cabin while Lucas tended his cattle and the small vegetative garden behind the house. When he wasn't working, he read to her from his books Thoreau's descriptions of Walden Pond, Whitman's celebrations of American wildness, his voice steady and surprisingly expressive. On the 4th morning, Prudence woke feeling stronger than she had in weeks. The weight in her chest had lessened, and the persistent cough had subsided to occasional spasms. When Lucas returned from checking fence lines, he found her outside, washing clothes in the creek. "Should you be up?" he asked, dismounting. "I can't keep imposing on your hospitality without contributing something," she replied, wringing out one of his shirts. "Besides, the fresh air feels wonderful after being ill." Lucas didn't argue, but he insisted on carrying the wet laundry back to the cabin for her. As they hung the clothes on a line strung between 2 pines, Prudence found herself studying him again. There was an ease to him she'd rarely encountered in men, a self-sufficiency that required no constant assertion of strength. "Have you lived alone all this time?" she asked. Lucas pinned a shirt to the line before answering. "Mostly. Had a partner for the first few years, old fur trapper named Caldwell, taught me everything about surviving out here before his heart gave out 3 winters ago." He paused. "Had a woman stay once too, widow from one of the mining camps. She lasted about 6 months before deciding civilization had its merits." The admission hung between them, charged with unspoken implications. Prudence felt a flutter of something unfamiliar, not the constant anxiety that had been her companion for months, but something warmer, more dangerous. "It takes a certain kind of person to embrace this life," she said carefully. Lucas met her eyes. "Yes, it does." That evening they sat outside as sunset painted the mountains gold and crimson. Prudence described Philadelphia, its cobblestone streets and bustling markets, the libraries where she'd escaped whenever possible, the constraining expectations placed on women of even modest means. "I never felt I belonged there," she admitted. "Every door required the right connections, the right background, the right appearance." "And now," Lucas asked, Prudence gazed at the mountains. "Now I'm beginning to understand why people come west. There's a freedom here that exists nowhere else." "Freedom comes with responsibility," Lucas cautioned. "Nature doesn't forgive carelessness." "Neither does society," Prudence countered, thinking of the men who had pursued her, their authority derived from wealth and political connections rather than any moral standing. As days stretched into a week, Prudence found herself settling into a rhythm alongside Lucas. She learned to cook on the wood stove, to identify edible plants in the surrounding forest, to anticipate the afternoon thunderstorms that swept through the mountains. Each morning, Lucas rode out to check his cattle or hunt. Each evening, they shared meals and conversation that grew increasingly comfortable. On the 8th day, Lucas taught her to shoot his Winchester. Prudence had never handled a firearm before, but she recognized the necessity in this isolated place. They set up cans on a fallen log, and Lucas stood behind her, adjusting her stance and grip. Breathe out as you squeeze the trigger, he instructed, his voice close to her ear. Don't jerk it. The rifle's report echoed against the mountainside as Prudence hit her target on the third attempt. She lowered the weapon, exhilarated by the small victory and acutely aware of Lucas's proximity. Quick learner, he remarked, a new respect in his eyes. Good teacher, she returned, holding his gaze a moment longer than necessary. That night, Prudence's sleep was troubled by dreams, not the usual nightmares of pursuit, but confused images of Philadelphia society merged with Wyoming wilderness and Lucas standing at the border between worlds. She woke before dawn, slipping outside to watch the stars fade as the eastern sky lightened. Lucas found her there as the sun crested the horizon. Without speaking, he handed her a cup of coffee and stood beside her, his shoulder nearly touching hers as they watched lights spill across the valley. The stage comes through tomorrow, he said finally, if you're still determined to leave. Prudence felt the statement like a physical blow. The past 10 days had created an illusion of safety she wasn't ready to relinquish. Where would I go? She asked, voicing the question that had haunted her for months. Could head to California, Lucas suggested, or up to Montana Territory, anywhere far from Philadelphia. And the documents. The words slipped out before she could stop them. Lucas turned to her, one eyebrow raised. Documents. Prudence closed her eyes briefly. The truth had been pressing against her chest as persistently as her cough. There's more to my story than I've told you. Inside the cabin, she retrieved the oilskin packet she kept wrapped in the center of her spare clothes. The papers inside detailed a sophisticated scheme involving diverted government funds intended for post-war reconstruction, implicating her former employer and several prominent businessmen with political connections. I was more than a governess, she explained as Lucas examined the documents. I managed household accounts for Mr. Blackwood. When I discovered these discrepancies, I investigated further. What I found. She gestured at the papers. These men stole millions intended to rebuild communities destroyed by the war. When I tried to report it, I discovered the local authorities were involved too. Lucas whistled softly. No wonder they've been chasing you. This would put half of Philadelphia's elite in prison. They killed the journalist I contacted, Prudence said quietly, made it look like a robbery. That's when I ran. Lucas carefully refolded the papers, his expression grave. Why show me this now? Because I'm tired of running, Prudence admitted, and because I trust you. The admission hung between them, weighted with implications neither was ready to voice. Lucas handed the packet back to her. The federal marshal in Cheyenne is a good man, fought for the Union, can't be bought. If anyone would handle this properly, it's him. Cheyenne is 4 days' ride, Prudence said doubtfully, 3 if we push. Lucas's use of we didn't escape her notice. I know the trails better than any stage driver. You would go with me? Prudence asked, unable to mask her surprise. Leave your home, your cattle, got a neighbor 15 miles south who owes me a favor. He can check the herd for a week or 2. Lucas met her eyes steadily. Unless you'd rather I didn't come. The offer transmitted something deeper than mere assistance, and they both knew it. Something had grown between them in these quiet days, something neither had anticipated but both now recognized. I would be grateful for your company, Prudence said softly. They left at dawn the following day, riding south through mountain passes Lucas knew by heart. Prudence, who had never ridden more than occasionally in Philadelphia's parks, found her body adjusting to the rhythm of the sturdy mare Lucas had provided. By midday, they had covered nearly 20 miles, stopping only when Lucas spotted a plume of dust on their back trail. Probably nothing, he said, though his hand rested on his rifle. But let's move into the trees just in case. They spent that night in a sheltered ravine, far from any established trail. Lucas built a small fire, shielded from view by rock walls, and they ate a simple meal of jerky and hardtack. As darkness settled around them, the vast field of stars overhead seemed close enough to touch. I've never seen so many stars, Prudence remarked, leaning back against her saddle. City lights dim them, Lucas replied. Out here nothing gets between you and the heavens. Their conversation drifted to childhood memories Prudence's strict upbringing in her father's household, where education was valued but independence discouraged. Lucas's rural Virginia youth, interrupted by a war that had taken not just his parents but any sense of belonging to his birthplace. The West was the only direction that made sense, he explained, stoking the fire. No past out here, only future. Is that why you live so remotely? Prudence asked. To escape the past entirely, Lucas considered this. Partly, but there's more to it than that. In the city, people live on top of each other but never truly see one another. Out here, when you encounter someone, the meeting matters. It has meaning. His eyes met hers across the fire, and Prudence understood he was speaking of their own encounter, the randomness of it, and the significance it had acquired. Like us, she said quietly. Like us, he agreed. The distance between them seemed to contract, the night air charged with possibility. Lucas moved to sit beside her, his shoulder brushing hers as he added wood to the fire. Prudence, he began, his voice lower than usual. I don't know what happens when we reach Cheyenne. Those documents might bring you trouble or justice or both. But I want you to know, a distant sound interrupted him, hoofbeats approaching from the south. Lucas was on his feet instantly, extinguishing the fire with dirt and reaching for his rifle. 3 riders moving fast, he whispered. Could be nothing, but it's them, Prudence said with certainty, fear constricting her throat. Somehow they've found me. Lucas quickly saddled their horses. There's a canyon about 2 miles east, narrow entrance, easy to defend. We can make it if we ride hard. They mounted in the darkness, relying on the horses' sure-footedness as they picked their way through the rocky terrain. Behind them, the hoofbeats grew steadily louder. As they crested a small rise, a gunshot cracked through the night, the bullet splintering a tree trunk near Prudence's head. Ride, Lucas urged, spurring his horse forward. They raced through the darkness, Prudence clinging desperately to her mare's mane as branches whipped past. Lucas led them down a steep embankment, across a shallow creek, and finally into the mouth of a narrow canyon barely wide enough for a single horse. Stay behind that boulder, he instructed, dismounting and positioning himself at the canyon entrance, rifle ready. 3 shadowy figures appeared on the ridge above, silhouetted against the night sky. One raised a rifle, but Lucas fired first. The man cried out, clutching his shoulder as he fell back. That's a warning, Lucas called. Next one won't be, the woman has stolen property. One of the men shouted back. This doesn't concern you, stranger. She's under my protection, Lucas replied, his voice carrying in the still night air. Turn back now, or this canyon becomes your grave. A tense silence followed, broken only by the nervous stamping of horses' hooves. Finally, the leader spoke again. This isn't over. Those papers are worth more than your life. Not to me, Lucas answered simply. After a moment, the riders withdrew, their hoofbeats fading into the distance. Lucas maintained his position for another hour before returning to where Prudence waited, trembling with cold and fear. They'll be back, she said, despair coloring her voice. With more men, they'll never stop. Lucas took her hands, chafing them between his to warm them. Then we don't stop either. We ride through the night, take routes no stage would attempt. I know these mountains better than any Eastern gunman. His confidence steadied her. They rode until dawn, pushing the horses as much as they dared through treacherous terrain. When they finally stopped to rest at a hidden spring high in the mountains, Prudence felt the familiar tightness returning to her chest. The coughing began suddenly, violent spasms that doubled her over in the saddle. Lucas helped her dismount, supporting her weight as she struggled to breathe. Easy, he murmured, guiding her to sit against a rock. We've been riding too hard for your lungs. He mixed the last of his herbal remedy with water from the spring, helping her drink between coughing fits. When the worst had passed, Prudence leaned against him, utterly spent. I'm slowing you down, she rasped, her voice broken from coughing. You should go ahead, bring back the marshal. Lucas's arm tightened around her shoulders. "I'm not leaving you." The simple declaration contained volumes. Prudence looked up at him, seeing in his weathered face something she'd searched for without knowing it, not just protection but partnership, understanding, respect. "Why?" she whispered, needing to hear him say it. Lucas brushed a strand of hair from her face, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "Because in 10 years of solitude, I've never met anyone who made me want to break that silence. Until you." The kiss, when it came, was as natural as breathing, hesitant at first, then deepening as Prudence responded, her hands moving to frame his face. It was unlike anything she had experienced before, carrying none of the calculation or performance she'd observed in Philadelphia society matches. This was raw, honest connection, born of shared danger and growing trust. When they separated, Lucas rested his forehead against hers. "We should keep moving," he said reluctantly. "Still 2 days to Cheyenne." They traveled more cautiously after that, avoiding open ground and sticking to game trails Lucas had used over the years. The pursuers didn't reappear, though both remained vigilant, aware that the danger hadn't passed. During brief stops, they spoke of possibilities, what might happen once they reached Cheyenne, whether the marshal would believe their story, what justice might look like for the men implicated in Prudence's documents. They didn't speak of what might come after, though the question hung unasked between them. Prudence caught Lucas watching her sometimes with an expression that suggested he was imagining futures he hadn't previously considered. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, they crested a ridge to see Cheyenne spread below them, a bustling frontier town where railroad tracks cut through the heart of the settlement, connecting east to west in a tangible representation of America's expanding reach. "We made it," Prudence breathed, relief coursing through her. Lucas nodded, though his expression remained guarded. "The hard part comes next." They approached the town cautiously, Lucas leading them to a modest boarding house on a side street. The owner, a widow named Mrs. Parker, greeted him as an old acquaintance and asked no questions when he requested 2 rooms and discretion. "The marshal's office is 3 blocks west," Lucas explained as they settled into the small parlor. "I'll go speak with him first, see if he's as trustworthy as I remember." Prudence nodded, exhaustion catching up with her now that they had reached relative safety. "Be careful," she urged. "These men have connections everywhere." Lucas squeezed her hand before departing. Alone in the quiet room, Prudence found herself contemplating paths she hadn't dared consider during her months of running. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future beyond mere survival, perhaps even a future that included the quiet, steadfast man who had risked his life for her. Lucas returned an hour later, accompanied by a tall, stern-faced man with a federal marshal's badge pinned to his vest. Marshal James Harrington listened intently as Prudence explained her story, examining the documents with growing outrage. "This is exactly the kind of corruption President Grant has been trying to root out," Harrington said finally. "These papers, combined with your testimony, could bring down some very powerful men." "Will that be enough to protect her?" Lucas asked, his concern evident. "It will once I telegraph Washington," Harrington assured them. "The Attorney General has been building cases against several of these individuals already. Your evidence could be the missing piece." He turned to Prudence. "You've shown remarkable courage, Miss Zimmerman. The government will ensure your safety while these cases proceed." Relief washed over Prudence, though it was tempered by the realization that justice would require months of legal proceedings, testimony, and continued vigilance. As the marshal departed with her documents copies, not originals, she turned to Lucas, uncertainty plain on her face. "What happens now?" she asked softly. Lucas moved to stand before her, taking both her hands in his. "That depends on you." The marshal offered federal protection, maybe even a new identity once the trials are over. You could go anywhere, start fresh. "And you," Prudence pressed, her heart racing. "What will you do?" "I have a home in the mountains," he said simply. "Cattle that need tending, land that needs working." He paused, his thumbs tracing circles on her palms. "And a cabin that's felt empty since you left it." Prudence's breath caught in her throat. "Are you asking me to return with you?" "I'm asking for more than that," Lucas replied, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. "I'm asking if you could see a future there. With me. Not just hiding, but living, building something together." The question encompassed everything: partnership, commitment, love developing not from society's expectations but from genuine connection. It offered not an escape but a destination, a place of belonging rather than mere refuge. "I've spent my life following paths others laid out," Prudence said thoughtfully. "Even running was a reaction, not a choice." She looked up at him, seeing in his face all the possibilities of this unexpected future. "I think I'm ready to choose my own way now." Lucas's smile transformed his face, softening the lines etched by years of solitude. "And that way leads west." "To mountains and stars," Prudence confirmed, stepping into his embrace. "To difficult work and quiet evenings, to you." Their kiss sealed the promise not of perfection, but of partnership through whatever challenges lay ahead. As Lucas held her close, Prudence knew that the road before them would not be easy. There would be trials in Cheyenne, perhaps danger still from those who wished to silence her. The mountain homestead would demand everything they had to give, and wilderness made no allowances for weakness. Yet for the first time since fleeing Philadelphia, Prudence felt the weight lifting from her chest, replaced by a different kind of breathlessness. This was freedom, not the absence of constraints, but the presence of possibility. Not running from, but running toward. "We'll face it together," Lucas murmured against her hair, seeming to read her thoughts. "Whatever comes." Prudence thought of the night he had found her broken and desperate in the rain. "You're safe," he had promised then. "Rest now." She hadn't believed him at the time. Now, wrapped in his arms with the future stretching before them, she finally did.